So this is another one of those topics that I always feel like it is obvious in hindsight, but when you are head down in the middle of getting stuff done, I don't think people, well, in my case anyways, I didn't really think about it. Or I've thought about it and then forgotten it a couple of times. So, what is the difference between information and data? Like a lot of times we call it information science, or we call it data science, or we call it, right? But really, data is a pile of stuff, and it's only useful when we can turn that into information, or we know how to use it in some process where it is information that drives or affects that process. So we collect lots of data, right? Companies, NGOs, other organizations create amounts of data. The internet, unlimited storage in the cloud has just created this boom in data, and we keep everything. It is crazy, right? So from 2010, in the first 5 years in this little thing here, it grew by 10 zettabytes. God, like that wasn't even a thing prior to 2010. The entire planet was probably less than a zettabyte in the 90s. Probably less than a fifth of a zettabyte. Anyway, and then, the next 5 years it went up, what is that, like 49 zettabytes. In the next 5 years, it's going to double by another 60, or no, another 120 zettabytes, another 100 zettabytes, right? So the point is, we collect an ever-increasing amount of data, and in our operational systems, that's just in the data lake, but even in the systems that we run, we have a lot of data, but the question is, what is its information content? What is its utility, right? And this is going to come up and affect the way we design systems. I'm not really going to talk about it in this talk, but in another talk I'm working on, it's really the notion that should information be close to the place it operates, right? And so we'll talk about that. So information is data when it's tied to driving or feeding a process. So data becomes information only when we know how to use it. If I've got all this statistical data about a pandemic, and I have no idea how to use it, or I can't take any action with it, then, is it data or is it information? It's data at that point, right? Data becomes information when it drives or it integrates with a process, when it's got business rules around it that maybe have a different context for how that data can be structured or how it can be used or how it's managed than it does within some other context, right? So data becomes information when it means something within a bounded context, right? So that data becomes information when we can apply it. A bunch of those are kind of the same thing, but you either have data or you have information, and I'm going to talk about why that's important in a minute, right? So, the argument is I got this data, they called it a data swamp, right? For a long time in the cloud. Why is that? Because it's resting at the bottom of the lake. It has no information content, and it can't be applied, right? So data is valuable when you can convert it when you can convert it, right, into information. And so let's look a little bit more about that, right? So do we know how to use all the data, right? Do we know how to use the data we have? The answer is probably no. If you've got a data lake, the answer is no. If it's in your operational system, sometimes we commingle a bunch of different information about some piece of data. Like we know that it can be used for a couple different things, and so we'll put it together and mix a bunch of attributes on it, right? And we'll talk about that in a minute. Do we know if this data is valuable? Without those two things, do we know how to use the data, and do we know if it's valuable or what it could be used for? It has no informational content, right? And the reality is it is of low value to the organization. And so if we here's an example of this, right? A list of addresses is just data. So this is my Amazon thing. Geez, I hope I erased this correctly. So, if you look at this, it's just a list of addresses. There's no business process around it. There's nothing driving it. There's no semantic meaning about it. We're not doing, in this list, we're not going to do like some kind of marketing something, tax nothing, like whatever, right? Now, there are two in here you can barely see. One, as you can see, this is an Amazon page. That's the default address. So if the default address information, probably it's just data, right? So that becomes the default, and it's the default address outside of any process and outside of any transaction, any kind of use case, any kind of governance, like whatever it is, right? Like, it's got governance a little bit, but so that means it's data at that point, right? Now, what about the fresh address? Well, why did I even put that there? The Amazon and the default fresh address are really the same thing. They're just data. Now, when they get converted into an order, right? Data that drives or supports is information. So a shipping address, the fact that an address could be a shipping address, maybe that's information, maybe it's not. But the fact that a shipping address actually, did I erase enough here? I hope so, right? A shipping address is for an order is actually information. It is something that drives the business process. It determines where the trucks need to go, what warehouse it might have come on, what kind of packing it might be. I made that one up, right? Another use is, and that shipping address actually has a side effect, right? So inside the shipping system, it drives the transport. Inside the tax reporting system, this one actually gets bound. It's weird, right? But it gets bound to the sales tax. So it turns out the shipping address has meaning within the sales tax context. And so in that case, even though we have this address from the address list, that order and the order and what needs to be packaged up and where it's going is important to the shipping system, and the dollar volume of that order, the taxable dollar amount, and the tax district are important to the tax system. So that address, and this is why you end up making a copy a lot of times, right? So you have this list of addresses. When you go to ship it, the shipping system actually keeps a copy of that address because it operates within the context of that order and the shipment item, right? And the tax is the same way, right? If you're going to figure out what tax zone, part of that address needs to be applied and kept inside the tax context. And so in that case, this same address that was a default or non-default address on the previous page becomes information. So information is something, the use of something within a context, some type of context. And why do we say it like that? Oh man, I'll fix that page in the wiki. So, right, the acceptance rules could be different. It turns out that I might have certain sign-offs or certain kinds of regulatory things that I'm only allowed to use. What was the one? Oh, here, a PO box, right? It might be an address that we can use for shipping documentation or certain kinds of product, but that PO box might not be allowed for hazardous materials, right? So the fact that you shipped hazardous materials, billing doesn't care, tax doesn't care, a bunch of those don't care. They don't have those rules around it, right? But because you have rules about hazardous materials in the shipping system, that thing becomes information that drives the process in the shipping system, right? The trust levels might be different. If we're going to use something for mailers, we might have a low trust address that we gathered from somewhere, and within the context of marketing, we're willing to send that flyer, but it turns out in shipping, we actually need that person to validate that they believe that address is theirs so that we don't have boxes going to somebody else's address or some random place, right? So I'm just giving you examples, right? Like why would something have the same data could have different meaning, not only for the process, but it could have different rules around it. And there might, like I said, the regulator rules might be different. So in this one, a PO box might not be allowed for hazardous materials. Like I said, I will fix that slide when I do the export. So, and the data lake, that's why they call it a data lake, right? They don't call it an information lake. It's a data lake, right? So the person's U.S. addresses, which would have been information within those contexts, is data within the data lake, right? So if we talk about this as a little bit, right? Replicating data is fine. What that means is the same data could exist in multiple places, but the information it represents should only exist within one place, right? So if we talk about the like the shipping context, it's only data in the address list. And if we make a copy of that data into the shipping context, then replicating that data there is fine. But in the shipping context, it represents the address that package has gone to, and we wouldn't keep that anywhere else but in the shipping system, right? We might have an order address for the credit card. Anyway, so the idea is I can have data in multiple places, but within the context or contextual meaning of that data should only exist in one place. So how do we manage information across these contexts? Ooh, I wrote that wrong, right? How do we manage data and information across those contexts? And I'm going to tell you that's a topic for another talk. I'm out of time. Have a great day.